Sometimes the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the one who saves the day. Sometimes the quiet kid in the back of the classroom carries secrets that could change lives forever. And sometimes, when people judge others by what they see on the surface, they miss the most incredible story happening right in front of them. What happened that autumn afternoon at Lincoln High School wasn't just about bullying or standing up to bullies. It wasn't just about a teenager who dressed differently or acted differently from his classmates. This was about something much bigger, something that would make national news, bring grown men to tears, and teach an entire community that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. This is the true story of Marcus Chen, a 17-year-old who wore military camouflage to school every single day, endured months of ridicule from his classmates, and then did something so extraordinary that it changed everything. When that helicopter landed on the school football field that day, nobody was laughing anymore. In fact, they were about to discover that the boy they had been mocking was actually someone they should have been thanking all along. Marcus Chen walked through the hallways of Lincoln High School like a ghost that everyone could see, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Every morning he wore the same style of clothing that had become his trademark and his curse: military camouflage pants, combat boots that had seen better days, and various army surplus shirts that hung loose on his thin frame. To his classmates, he looked like he was playing soldier. To Marcus, these clothes were something much more meaningful, though he had never explained why to anyone. The morning of October 15th started like any other day for Marcus. He arrived at school early, walking past the groups of students who gathered in the courtyard before classes began. As usual, the whispers followed him like a shadow. He had grown used to the comments over the past 3 years of high school, but that didn't make them hurt any less. "Look, there goes Army Boy again," snickered Jake Morrison, one of the football players who seemed to take particular pleasure in making Marcus's life difficult. "Does he think he's going to war or something?" Marcus kept his head down and continued walking. He had learned long ago that responding to the taunts only made things worse. Jake and his friends had been targeting him since freshman year, and the harassment had only gotten more intense as time went on. What they didn't know, what nobody at school knew, was that Marcus had very good reasons for the way he dressed and acted. The first class of the day was American History with Mrs. Richie Grove Rodriguez. Marcus slipped into his usual seat in the back corner, hoping to blend into the background as much as possible. But even there, he couldn't escape the attention. 2 rows ahead of him, Sarah Jenkins turned around and whispered loudly enough for half the class to hear. "I heard he sleeps in those army clothes," she said to her friend. "Maybe he thinks the Taliban is going to attack Lincoln High." Several students giggled, and Marcus felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. Mrs. Rodriguez shot a warning look at Sarah, but the damage was already done. Marcus opened his history book and tried to focus on the lesson about World War II, though the irony wasn't lost on him that they were learning about real soldiers while his classmates mocked his appearance. During lunch, Marcus sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich his grandmother had packed for him. He watched as groups of students laughed and chatted at tables throughout the large room, and he wondered what it would be like to have friends like that. He had tried to make connections with his classmates over the years, but his quiet personality and unusual clothing choices had made him an easy target for ridicule instead of acceptance. "Hey G, Joe." The voice came from behind him, and Marcus didn't need to turn around to know it was Tyler Brooks, another member of Jake's group. "You planning to invade the chemistry lab this afternoon?" Tyler's friends erupted in laughter, and Marcus felt every pair of eyes in the cafeteria turn toward him. He wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and never come back to this place where he felt so unwelcome. But something deeper than embarrassment kept him in his seat. Something that his classmates couldn't understand because they had never taken the time to look beyond the surface. The truth was that Marcus Chen wasn't playing dress-up or trying to get attention. Every piece of clothing he wore had belonged to his older brother David, who had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years earlier while serving with the Army Rangers. Marcus wore David's clothes because it made him feel close to the brother who had been his hero, his role model, and his best friend. He wore them because David had died serving his country, and Marcus wanted to honor that sacrifice in the only way he knew how. But Marcus had never told anyone at school about David. The pain was too deep, too personal to share with people who already seemed determined to misunderstand him. His parents had moved the family to this town after David's death, hoping for a fresh start, but Marcus had carried his grief with him like invisible armor. The camouflage clothing was his way of keeping David's memory alive, even if nobody else understood. After lunch, Marcus headed to his locker to get books for his afternoon classes. As he spun the combination lock, he heard Jake Morrison's voice approaching from down the hallway. Marcus tried to hurry, hoping to grab his books and disappear before Jake noticed him, but he wasn't fast enough. Well, well, if it isn't our resident war hero, Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Tell me something, Marcus. Do you ever take off those ridiculous clothes, or do you shower in them too? Marcus closed his locker and turned to face Jake, who was flanked by 3 of his friends. The hallway was crowded with students heading to their next classes. But Marcus felt completely alone in that moment. He could feel dozens of pairs of eyes watching, waiting to see what would happen next. I'm just trying to get to class, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Oh, he speaks, Jake exclaimed with mock surprise. I was starting to think you only communicated through military hand signals or something. The crowd of watching students grew larger, sensing drama. Marcus felt trapped, surrounded by faces that ranged from amused to cruel. He clutched his books tighter and tried to step around Jake, but the bigger boy moved to block his path. You know what I think? Jake continued, his voice getting louder. I think you're just a poser. I think you wear those clothes because you want people to think you're tough. But really, you're just a weird little kid playing soldier. Marcus felt something snap inside him. For 2 years, he had endured countless comments and jokes about his appearance. He had been patient and quiet and had tried to ignore the constant harassment. But hearing Jake call him a poser, hearing him suggest that Marcus was somehow disrespecting real soldiers, was more than he could bear. You don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said, his voice stronger now but still shaking with emotion. Oh, really? Jake stepped closer, his face inches from Marcus's. Then why don't you enlighten us, army boy? What's your big secret? Why do you dress like you're about to ship out to Iraq? Marcus stared at Jake for a long moment, feeling the weight of every watching eye in the hallway. Part of him wanted to tell the truth, to explain about David and the sacrifice his brother had made. But another part of him, the part that had been protecting his heart for 2 years, couldn't bear to share something so precious with people who would probably just find new ways to mock him. It's none of your business, Marcus finally said. Jake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers. See? I told you he was just a poser. Probably bought all that stuff at a thrift store because he thinks it makes him look cool. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next class period, and the crowd began to disperse. Jake and his friends walked away, still chuckling about their latest harassment of Marcus. But as Marcus gathered his scattered books and headed to chemistry class, he didn't notice that one person had stayed behind to watch the entire confrontation. Mrs. Pohl. Patterson, the school guidance counselor, had been walking through the hallways when she heard the commotion. She had watched the entire scene unfold, and something about Marcus's reaction had caught her attention. Over her 15 years of working with teenagers, she had developed an instinct for recognizing when there was more to a story than what appeared on the surface. That afternoon, Mrs. Price approached up. Patterson made a note in Marcus's file to schedule a meeting with him. She didn't know what secrets the quiet boy in camouflage might be carrying, but she sensed that there was pain behind his unusual clothing choices and withdrawn behavior. Unfortunately, she would never get the chance to have that conversation with Marcus, because events were already in motion that would change everything. As Marcus sat in chemistry class, trying to focus on molecular formulas and chemical reactions, he had no idea that his phone was buzzing with an urgent message in his backpack. He had no idea that the quiet life he had built for himself was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way possible. And he certainly had no idea that by the end of the next school day, every single person who had ever mocked him would understand exactly why he wore his brother's clothes with such pride and determination. The message that waited for Marcus was from Colonel Harrison at the local military base, and it contained news that would not only vindicate Marcus in the eyes of his tormentors, but would also thrust him into a situation where all of his brother's training, all of the military knowledge he had absorbed over the years, would suddenly become a matter of life and death for people he had never met. But for now, Marcus simply sat in chemistry class, enduring whispered comments from nearby students about his appearance, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change in the most dramatic way imaginable. Marcus discovered the message during his last class of the day. English literature with Mr. Thompson was usually one of his favorite subjects, but today he was having trouble concentrating on the discussion about symbolism in war poetry. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were analyzing poems written by soldiers while his classmates continued to whisper jokes about his military clothing. When the final bell rang, Marcus gathered his books and headed for his locker. It was only then, as he reached for his backpack, that he noticed his phone had been buzzing with notifications. School policy required phones to be turned off during classes, so Marcus had missed several urgent messages and missed calls. The first message was from his grandmother asking him to call her immediately. The second was from a number he didn't recognize, but the caller ID showed it was from the military base outside town. The third message made his blood run cold. Marcus, this is Colonel Harrison from Fort Stevens. I need you to call me immediately regarding a situation that requires your unique knowledge and assistance. This is extremely urgent. Please contact me as soon as you receive this message. Marcus's hands shook as he read the message again. Colonel Harrison had been his brother David's commanding officer, and Marcus had met him several times during family visits to the base. But why would the colonel be contacting him now, almost 2 years after David's death? With trembling fingers, Marcus dialed the number. Colonel Harrison answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting by the phone. Marcus? Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Colonel Harrison, what's going on? Marcus asked, his voice barely steady. Son, I need you to listen carefully. We have a situation, and you might be the only person who can help us solve it. Marcus looked around the now empty hallway, making sure no one could overhear his conversation. I don't understand, sir. What kind of situation? 3 hours ago, a military transport helicopter made an emergency landing in the mountains about 40 miles from your location. The aircraft was carrying medical supplies and equipment destined for a field hospital overseas, but more importantly, it was carrying Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of the Army's top combat medics, who was being transferred to provide critical care for wounded soldiers. Marcus listened intently, trying to understand why this information was being shared with him. Colonel Harrison continued, his voice grave. The helicopter went down due to mechanical failure in a heavily forested area. Dr. Vasquez survived the crash, but she's trapped in the wreckage with serious injuries. Our rescue teams have been unable to reach her because of the terrain and weather conditions. We've tried everything, Marcus, but we're running out of time. Sir, I still don't understand how I can help, Marcus said, though something in his gut was beginning to make him suspect where this conversation was headed. Marcus, your brother David spent 6 months in those mountains during a special training exercise. He mapped every trail, every landmark, every possible route through that terrain. He knew those mountains better than anyone else in his unit. Marcus felt his heart begin to race. David's maps, he whispered. Exactly. David told me once that he shared all of his geographical knowledge with you, but you too spent hours going over his maps and routes. He said you had an incredible memory for terrain and navigation. Is that true, son? Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the countless evenings he and David had spent poring over topographical maps. David had been passionate about land navigation and had taught Marcus everything he knew about reading terrain, identifying landmarks, and finding the safest routes through difficult country. It had been their special bonding activity, something that connected them even when David was deployed overseas. Yes, sir, Marcus said quietly. David taught me everything. Marcus, we need those maps, and we need someone who understands David's route markings and navigation techniques. Our regular rescue teams don't know the area well enough, and we can't risk sending them in blind. Dr. Vasquez has internal injuries and severe bleeding. She won't survive much longer without medical intervention. The weight of the situation began to settle on Marcus's shoulders. A woman's life was hanging in the balance, and apparently he was the only person who could help save her. What do you need me to do? Marcus asked. We need you to guide our rescue team to Dr. Vasquez's location. You would be working with a small team of experienced medics and rescue specialists, but you would be the navigator. Without your knowledge of David's routes, they'll never find her in time. Marcus thought about David's room at home, which his parents had left exactly as it was when he died. All of David's maps, notes, and navigation materials were still there, carefully preserved. Marcus knew every detail of those maps because he and David had studied them together so many times. Colonel, there's something you should know, Marcus said. I'm 17. I'm still in high school. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, I know this is asking a lot of you. Under normal circumstances, we would never involve a civilian, especially someone your age. But this isn't a normal circumstance. Dr. Vasquez is one of the finest combat medics in the Army. She has saved dozens of lives in combat zones, and she's about to be deployed to save dozens more. We cannot let her die in those mountains. Marcus thought about David, about all the stories his brother had told him about the medics who had saved wounded soldiers overseas. He thought about the years of mockery and isolation he had endured at school, and how none of his classmates understood why he wore his brother's clothes or why the military meant so much to him. I'll do it, Marcus said without hesitation. Are you sure about this, son? The terrain is dangerous and the weather is getting worse. This won't be an easy mission. My brother died serving his country, Marcus replied, his voice steady now. If I can help save someone who's dedicated her life to saving soldiers, then I have to try. David would have done the same thing. Colonel Harrison was quiet for a moment. Your brother would be proud of you, Marcus. Can you get to Fort Stevens within the hour and bring all of David's maps and navigation materials? Yes, sir, I'll be there. As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that his entire life was about to change. In a few hours, he would be doing something more important than anything he had ever done before. But first, he had to get home, gather David's materials, and somehow explain to his parents why their 17-year-old son was about to participate in a military rescue mission. Marcus practically ran to the school parking lot where his grandmother was waiting to pick him up. Mrs. Chen had been driving him to and from school since he was old enough to attend, and she immediately noticed the urgency in his movements. Marcus, what's wrong? She asked in Mandarin as he jumped into the passenger seat. Marcus quickly explained the situation to his grandmother, who listened with growing concern and amazement. Mrs. Chen had always known that Marcus and David shared a special bond, but she had never imagined that David's teachings would someday be needed to save a life.
We must go home immediately and tell your parents, she said, starting the car.
The drive home felt like the longest 20 minutes of Marcus's life. He kept thinking about Dr. Vasquez, somewhere in the mountains, injured and waiting for help that might not come in time. He thought about David, and about all the hours they had spent studying maps together. Most of all, he thought about the fact that for the first time in his life, the military knowledge that made him different from his classmates was actually going to matter in the most important way possible. When they arrived home, Marcus burst through the front door to find both of his parents in the kitchen. His father, Dr. Chen, was grading papers from his college engineering classes, while his mother was preparing dinner. Both looked up in surprise at Marcus's dramatic entrance. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something important, Marcus said, still breathing hard from the adrenaline of the phone call. His parents exchanged worried glances. Marcus was usually quiet and reserved, so his current state of agitation was completely out of character. Marcus quickly explained Colonel Harrison's phone call and the rescue mission. He told them about Dr. Vasquez, about the maps that David had created, and about the fact that he might be the only person who could guide the rescue team to her location. His father stood up slowly, his face grave. Marcus, this sounds extremely dangerous. You're talking about going into the mountains with a military rescue team. I know it's dangerous, Dad, but David's maps are the only way they can find her. She's going to die if we don't help. His mother, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. Show me David's maps. Marcus led his parents upstairs to David's room. The space had been preserved exactly as David had left it during his last visit home. Military medals and commendations covered one wall, while another wall was covered with detailed topographical maps of the local mountain region. David's notes were written in his careful handwriting across the maps, marking safe routes, dangerous areas, water sources, and emergency shelter locations. Marcus pointed to specific markings on the maps. See these red lines? Those are the routes David said were safest during bad weather, and these blue marks show where there are natural shelters. David spent months learning every detail of this terrain. His father studied the maps carefully, his engineering mind analyzing the complexity of the route markings and navigation notes. Marcus, do you really understand all of this well enough to guide a rescue team? David and I went over these maps dozens of times, Marcus replied. He made me memorize the key landmarks and route options. He said that knowledge could save lives someday. His mother was looking at a photograph of David in his army uniform, the same uniform whose components Marcus wore to school every day. David always said that Marcus had a gift for navigation and terrain reading, she said quietly. He was so proud of how quickly Marcus learned everything he taught him. Dr. Chen walked to the window and looked out at the mountains in the distance. Storm clouds were gathering on the peaks, and the wind was beginning to pick up. The weather is getting worse. If they're going to attempt this rescue, it needs to happen soon. Marcus gathered all of David's maps, compass, elevation guides, and navigation notes. As he carefully placed each item in David's old military backpack, he felt a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. For 2 years, he had worn his brother's clothes to honor David's memory. Now, he was about to use David's knowledge to honor his legacy in the most meaningful way possible. His parents drove him to Fort Stevens in tense silence. As they approached the military base, Marcus could see helicopters being prepared and rescue personnel gathering equipment. The reality of what he was about to do began to sink in, but instead of fear, he felt a growing sense of determination. Colonel Harrison met them at the base entrance, a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service. He shook hands with Marcus's parents and spoke with them privately for several minutes before approaching Marcus. "Son, are you ready for this?" the colonel asked. Marcus adjusted the straps of David's backpack, feeling the weight of the maps and equipment inside. "Yes, sir. Let's go save Dr. Vasquez." As they walked toward the waiting helicopter, Marcus had no idea that back at Lincoln High School, news of his involvement in the rescue mission was already beginning to spread. One of the school administrators had overheard his phone conversation with Colonel Harrison, and word was quickly making its way through the faculty and then to students and parents. By the time Marcus climbed into the military helicopter that would take him to the search area, half the town was already talking about the quiet boy in camouflage who had been called upon to help with a life-or-death rescue mission. The same students who had mocked him that morning were about to learn that there was much more to Marcus Chen than they had ever imagined. The descent into the ravine was more treacherous than Marcus had anticipated, even with David's detailed route notes. The natural ledges that formed David's stairway were slick with moisture from the approaching storm, and loose rocks shifted underfoot with every step. Marcus led the way, testing each foothold carefully before signaling the rest of the team to follow. "Take your time," Captain Brooks called out as they slowly made their way down the ravine wall. "A controlled descent is more important than speed right now." Marcus could see the crashed helicopter more clearly now. The aircraft had come down hard, its main rotor blades twisted and broken from impact with the trees. The fuselage was partially crushed, but still largely intact. Most importantly, he could see movement inside the cockpit area where Dr. Vasquez was trapped. "Dr. Vasquez, we can see you now," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez radioed ahead. "We're about 2 minutes from reaching your position." "Thank God," came the weak reply. "I was starting to think nobody would be able to find this place." As they reached the bottom of the ravine, Marcus was struck by how accurate David's maps had been. Every detail was exactly as David had noted. The creek bed curved around a large boulder, creating a natural landing area. There was a flat section of ground perfect for setting up medical equipment. And there were even specific trees that David had marked as anchor points for climbing gear. The rescue team immediately went to work. While Captain Brooks and Specialist Kim began assessing the helicopter wreckage and planning how to extract Dr. Vasquez safely, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez set up a temporary medical station using the supplies they had carried down. Marcus found himself with a moment to catch his breath and really look at what they had accomplished. They were standing in a location that the military's regular rescue teams had considered completely inaccessible. Yet David's route had brought them here safely and efficiently. The navigation system his brother had developed through months of careful exploration had worked exactly as intended. "Marcus," Captain Brooks called out, "we're going to need your help with something else." Marcus hurried over to where the captain was studying David's map alongside the helicopter wreckage. "What is it, sir?" "Dr. Vasquez has a severe leg injury that's going to make it extremely difficult to carry her back up the route we used to get down here. Do any of David's notes show an alternative exit route that might be easier for an injured person?" Marcus spread David's map out on a flat rock and studied the alternative routes his brother had marked. There were indeed other options, but they were more complex and would require different navigation skills. "There are 2 other possibilities," Marcus said, pointing to markings on the map. David marked a route that follows the creek bed further downstream to a point where the ravine walls are lower and less steep. "But that route is longer and would take us through an area David marked as potentially dangerous during bad weather." Captain Brooks looked up at the sky, where storm clouds were growing darker and more threatening by the minute. "What's the other option?" Marcus traced another route on the map. "David found a way to access an old mining road that runs along the ridge above us. The entrance to the road is hidden, but David marked the exact location. If we could signal our helicopter to meet us at the mining road, we wouldn't have to carry Dr. War." "Vasquez is far. Show me," Captain Brooks said. Marcus led the captain to a spot where they could see up the eastern wall of the ravine. About halfway up the slope, partially hidden by overhanging trees, there was what looked like a natural gap in the rock face. David's notes say that gap is actually the entrance to an old mining tunnel that connects to the road above. The tunnel is safe to use, but you have to know exactly where to find the entrance. Captain Brooks studied the route with his binoculars. "Marcus, that tunnel entrance is at least 40 feet up a nearly vertical rock face. How are we supposed to get an injured person up there?" Marcus checked David's notes again. David installed climbing anchors and rope guides for exactly this kind of situation. He knew this area might be needed for emergency extractions. Sure enough, when they looked more carefully, they could see several metal anchors that David had discreetly installed in the rock face. The anchors were weathered and camouflaged, but they provided secure attachment points for climbing ropes. While the team leaders discussed extraction options, Marcus made his way over to the crashed helicopter to check on Dr. Vasquez. She was conscious but clearly in significant pain, with a deep gash on her leg and what appeared to be several broken ribs. "You must be Marcus," she said weakly when she saw him approaching. "Colonel Harrison told me over the radio that David Chen's little brother was guiding the rescue team. Your brother saved my life once before, you know." Marcus was startled by this revelation.
He did?
Afghanistan, 18 months ago. My medical unit came under attack, and we were trapped in a building that was being targeted by enemy mortars. David and his team created a diversion that allowed us to evacuate wounded soldiers. He risked his own life to save mine and 12 other people that day. Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. He had known that David was a hero, but hearing specific details of his brother's courage from someone David had actually saved made the reality of his sacrifice even more meaningful. "David talked about you all the time," Dr. Vasquez continued. "He was so proud of how quickly you learnt everything he taught you about navigation and terrain reading. He said you had a natural gift for understanding the landscape. I just paid attention to what he was teaching me," Marcus said quietly. "No, it's more than that. What you've done today, guiding this rescue team through terrain that stopped our regular rescue units, that's not something just anyone could do. You have your brother's instincts and his dedication to helping others." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached with medical supplies. "Marcus, we're going to start working on stabilizing Dr. Vasquez for transport. Captain Brooks wants you to guide him up to that tunnel entrance to verify that the mining road route is viable." Marcus nodded and rejoined Captain Brooks, who had already begun setting up climbing gear based on David's anchor points. The climb to the tunnel entrance was challenging, but David's route planning made it much more manageable than it would have been otherwise. The tunnel itself was exactly as David had described in his notes. It was an old mining passage that had been carved into the rock decades earlier, and while it was narrow and dark, it was structurally sound and provided a direct route to the mining road above. "This is incredible," Captain Brooks said as they emerged from the tunnel onto the old mining road. "How did your brother find all of these routes?" "David spent months exploring every possible pathway through this area," Marcus explained. He said that in combat situations, having multiple route options could mean the difference between mission success and mission failure. He approached this civilian terrain with the same thoroughness he used in military operations. Captain Brooks radioed their helicopter pilot to confirm that the mining road was accessible for pickup. Within minutes, they could hear the helicopter approaching their location, and Marcus felt a surge of relief that they would be able to extract Dr. Vasquez safely. The return trip through the tunnel with Dr. Robert Vasquez was the most challenging part of the entire rescue operation. Despite her injuries, Dr. Vasquez remained conscious and cooperative as the team carefully carried her through the narrow passage. Marcus led the way with a flashlight, using David's notes to identify potential obstacles and safe resting points along the route. When they finally emerged from the tunnel onto the mining road, the military helicopter was waiting for them. Vasquez was quickly loaded onto a medical stretcher and prepared for transport to the nearest hospital. As the helicopter lifted off with Dr. Vasquez aboard, Marcus stood on the old mining road and looked out over the mountains where he and David had spent so many hours learning navigation skills. The storm clouds were breaking apart now, and shafts of late afternoon sunlight were beginning to penetrate the forest canopy below. "Marcus," Captain Brooks said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "what you accomplished today was extraordinary. You didn't just help us rescue Dr. Vasquez. You proved that your brother's dedication to thorough preparation and detailed planning continues to save lives even after his death." As they waited for the helicopter to return and transport the rescue team back to Fort Stevens, Marcus thought about the events of the day. When he had woken up that morning, he was just the quiet kid in camouflage clothing who endured daily mockery from his classmates. Now, he was part of a successful military rescue operation that had saved the life of a decorated combat medic. But more than that, Marcus realized that he had finally found a way to honor David's memory that went beyond wearing his brother's clothes or keeping his room exactly as he had left it. Today, Marcus had used David's knowledge and training to make a real difference in the world, just as David had always intended. When the helicopter arrived to take them home, Marcus carefully packed David's maps and navigation equipment back into the military backpack. But he knew that this wouldn't be the last time these materials would be needed. Colonel Harrison had already mentioned the possibility of Marcus helping to train other military personnel in David's navigation techniques. As the helicopter flew back toward Fort Stevens, Marcus could see Lincoln High School in the distance. Tomorrow, he would return to his normal life as a student, but he knew that everything had changed. He was no longer just David's little brother who wore military surplus clothing. He was someone who had proven himself capable of rising to meet an extraordinary challenge when lives were at stake. What Marcus didn't know was that news of his role in the rescue operation was already spreading throughout the community. By the time he arrived home that evening, reporters were already gathering outside his house, and Colonel Harrison was fielding calls from military officials who wanted to know more about the 17-year-old civilian who had guided a successful rescue mission through terrain that had stymied experienced military personnel. The quiet boy who had been mocked for wearing camouflage to school was about to become a local hero, but more importantly, he had discovered that David's legacy of service and sacrifice was something he could carry forward in his own life. The next morning at Lincoln High School began unlike any other in the school's history. As students arrived for classes, they were greeted by an unusual sight in the parking lot: a military helicopter sitting on the football field, surrounded by news vans and reporters. Word had spread overnight about Marcus Chen's role in the mountain rescue operation, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the quiet boy in camouflage who had helped save a woman's life. Marcus arrived at school in his father's car, trying to avoid the media attention that had been building since the previous evening. Colonel Harrison had called the night before to inform the Chen family that Dr. Vasquez was stable and recovering well from her injuries, and that her successful rescue was being credited directly to Marcus's navigation expertise. "Son, I want you to know that what you did yesterday was truly extraordinary," Colonel Harrison had told him over the phone. "Dr. Vasquez would not have survived another night in those mountains. Your brother's training and your application of that knowledge saved her life." But as Marcus walked toward the school entrance, he wasn't thinking about being a hero. He was thinking about facing his classmates, many of whom had spent 3 years mocking him for the very military connection that had made yesterday's rescue possible. As he approached his locker, Marcus noticed something different. The hallways were quieter than usual, and students were looking at him with expressions he had never seen before. There was no mockery, no snickering about his camouflage clothing. Instead, there was something that looked like respect, mixed with curiosity, and perhaps a touch of shame. "Marcus?" The voice belonged to Sarah Jenkins, one of the students who had been particularly cruel in her comments about his appearance. "Is it true what they're saying on the news? Did you really help rescue someone in the mountains yesterday?" Marcus paused at his locker, unsure how to respond. For 3 years, Sarah had been one of his most persistent tormentors, making jokes about his military clothing and quiet demeanor. Now she was standing in front of him with a completely different expression on her face. "Yes, it's true," Marcus said simply. "The news said you were the only person who knew how to navigate through the mountains where the helicopter crashed. They said the regular rescue teams couldn't find a way to reach the injured person." Marcus thought about Dr. Vasquez, who was probably waking up in a hospital bed that morning instead of dying alone in the mountains. "My brother David mapped that area extensively when he was training with his military unit. I helped the rescue team use his routes to reach the crash site." Other students had begun to gather around, listening to the conversation. Marcus recognized many faces from the crowds that had watched him being bullied over the years, but now they were looking at him with genuine interest rather than amusement. Jake Morrison appeared from down the hallway, walking more slowly than usual. The football player who had taken such pleasure in tormenting Marcus looked uncomfortable and uncertain as he approached the group of students around Marcus's locker. "Marcus," Jake said, his voice lacking its usual aggressive confidence, "I heard about what you did yesterday. That's pretty amazing." Marcus studied Jake's face, looking for signs of sarcasm or hidden mockery, but he found none. Jake appeared to be genuinely struggling with something, and Marcus realized that his tormentor was probably grappling with the revelation that the person he had been bullying was actually someone worth respecting. "I also heard," Jake continued, "that your brother was killed serving in Afghanistan. I didn't know that." The hallway had gone completely quiet now. Marcus felt dozens of pairs of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented acknowledgement from his primary tormentor. "David died 2 years ago," Marcus said quietly. "He was serving with the Army Rangers when his unit was ambushed during a mission to protect Afghan civilians." Jake looked down at his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of this revelation.
"Marcus, I owe you an apology."
"We all do. I didn't understand why you dressed the way you do, and instead of trying to understand, I just made fun of you for it." "Those aren't costumes or some kind of weird fashion choice," another voice added. Tyler Brooks, one of Jake's closest friends, stepped forward. "You've been wearing your dead brother's clothes to honor his memory, and we've been making jokes about it for 3 years." Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of him was relieved that the constant mockery might finally be ending. But another part of him was sad that it had taken a dramatic rescue mission for his classmates to see him as a real person worthy of respect. "Why didn't you ever tell us about your brother?" Sarah asked. "If we had known, would it have mattered?" Marcus replied. "David's sacrifice didn't make me any different than I was before yesterday. I was the same person when you were making jokes about my clothes. The only thing that changed is that you learned something about my family that you didn't know before." The uncomfortable silence that followed Marcus's words was broken by the arrival of Principal Williams, who was accompanied by a man in military dress uniform. "Marcus," Principal Williams said, "I'd like you to meet Captain Roberts from the Public Affairs Office at Fort Stevens. He's here to discuss yesterday's rescue operation with our students and faculty."
Captain Roberts stepped forward and shook Marcus's hand.
"Chen, Colonel Harrison asked me to present you with something on behalf of the entire command at Fort Stevens." The captain opened a small wooden box and removed a military commendation medal. "This is the Army's Civilian Service Achievement Award. It's presented to civilians who provide extraordinary service in support of military operations. Your actions yesterday directly resulted in saving the life of Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of our most decorated combat medics." As Captain Roberts pinned the medal to Marcus's shirt, the gathered students burst into spontaneous applause. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention and recognition, but also proud that David's training had been put to such important use. "I'd also like to share some additional information about Dr. Vasquez," Captain Roberts continued. "She's not just any combat medic. Over the course of 3 deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, she has saved the lives of more than 200 wounded soldiers. She was being transferred to a new assignment where she would have trained other medics in advanced battlefield medicine."
Because of Marcus's actions yesterday, Dr. Frank Shetbeck tested Mantelo.
"Vasquez will be able to continue that mission and potentially save hundreds more lives in the future." The full impact of what Marcus had accomplished was beginning to sink in, not just for him but for everyone listening. This wasn't just about rescuing one person from a helicopter crash. Marcus's navigation skills had preserved the life of someone whose medical expertise would save countless others. Mrs. Patterson, the guidance counselor who had noticed Marcus's confrontation with Jake the day before, stepped forward. "Marcus, I think our entire school community owes you an apology. We failed to see the person you really are, and we allowed behavior to continue that was hurtful and wrong." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some students looked ashamed. Others appeared genuinely amazed by what they had learned. A few seemed to be struggling to reconcile the heroic actions they had heard about with the quiet, withdrawn classmate they thought they knew. "I appreciate the apology," Marcus said, "but I don't need everyone to see me differently because of what happened yesterday. I just want to be able to come to school without being made fun of for wearing my brother's clothes." "It's going to be more than that now," Principal Williams said. "Marcus, the story of your rescue mission has been picked up by national news outlets. You're going to be getting a lot of attention over the next few weeks." As if on cue, a student burst into the hallway from outside. "There are more news trucks arriving. And I think I saw someone from one of the morning TV shows." Marcus felt a surge of anxiety. He had never wanted to be famous or to be the center of attention. He had simply wanted to honor David's memory and help save Dr. Vasquez when the opportunity arose. Colonel Harrison appeared in the hallway, having been escorted into the school by security. "Marcus, I'm sorry to interrupt your school day, but we have a situation developing that requires your input." "What kind of situation, sir?" 3 more military units have contacted Fort Stevens requesting information about your brother's navigation techniques and route mapping methods. They want to know if you would be willing to help train their personnel in David's approach to terrain analysis." Marcus looked around at his classmates who were hanging on every word of the conversation. Just 24 hours earlier, these same people had seen him as a weird outsider who dressed strangely and kept to himself. Now they were witnessing him being recruited by multiple military units for his specialized knowledge. "There's something else," Colonel Harrison continued. "The Department of Defense has expressed interest in having David's maps and navigation techniques formally incorporated into military training programs. They want to offer you a position as a civilian consultant to help develop new navigation training curricula." The hallway erupted in excited whispers. Students who had never paid positive attention to Marcus were now realizing that their classmate was being offered opportunities that most adults would consider extraordinary. Marcus thought about David, about all the hours they had spent together studying maps and learning to read terrain. David had always said that knowledge was only valuable if it was shared and used to help others. Now Marcus had the opportunity to share David's expertise with people who could use it to save lives in the future. "I'd like to think about it," Marcus told Colonel Harrison, "and I'd like to discuss it with my parents." "Of course. Take all the time you need." As the colonel walked away and the crowd of students began to disperse for first period classes, Marcus found himself standing alone with Jake Morrison. The football player seemed to be struggling to find words for something he needed to say. "Marcus," Jake finally began, "I want you to know that I'm not apologizing just because you turned out to be some kind of hero. I'm apologizing because I was wrong about you from the beginning, and I should have been better than that." Marcus studied Jake's face and saw genuine remorse there. "Why did you pick on me, Jake? What did I ever do to you?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I think it was because you seemed so sure of yourself, even though you were different from everyone else. You never tried to fit in or change who you were, even when people made fun of you. That bothered me because I spent so much time worrying about what other people think of me." This revelation surprised Marcus. He had always assumed that popular students like Jake were confident and secure, not struggling with their own insecurities. "I was never sure of myself," Marcus said. "I was just trying to honor my brother's memory in the only way I knew how." "That's what I mean," Jake replied. "You had something more important to you than fitting in with the crowd." "I guess I was jealous of that." As Marcus headed to his first class, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in less than 24 hours. The rescue mission had not only saved Dr. Vasquez's life, but it had also revealed to his community that there was much more to him than they had ever bothered to discover. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had found a way to carry forward David's legacy that went beyond wearing his brother's clothes or preserving his room. David's knowledge and training were going to live on through Marcus's ability to share them with others who could use them to save lives. As he took his seat in American history class, Marcus looked around at his classmates with new eyes. Some were still stealing glances at him, clearly still processing everything they had learned that morning. But Marcus was no longer concerned about their opinions or their acceptance. He had found his purpose, and it was bigger than high school social dynamics or teenage popularity. He was going to spend his life making sure that David's sacrifice and expertise continued to make a difference in the world, one rescued person at a time. The quiet boy in camouflage had finally shown everyone who he really was, and it turned out he was someone worth knowing after all.